This is Chapter 22, Part A, on the digestive system. So the main function of the digestive system is to take in food and then break that food down into its basic nutrient molecules that we can then absorb those nutrients into the bloodstream, where it'll be delivered to all of the body's tissues and cells, and then also to rid the body of any indigestible remains as feces. So organs of the digestive system fall into two major groups. So we have the alimentary canal, which is basically the gastrointestinal or GI tract, or sometimes just referred to as the gut. So it's essentially just a long, continuous muscular tube that's going to run all the way from the mouth through the stomach, intestines, and to the anus. So as it travels throughout the GI tract, food is going to be broken down into smaller and smaller fragments until we break it down into its kind of basic molecular building blocks that we can then absorb through the intestinal lining into the blood. So some organs involved in this alimentary canal include the mouth, the pharynx or the throat, esophagus, stomach, small intestine into the large intestine, and then finally out through the anus. Second group of organs in the GI tract or digestive system are accessory organs. So these are things that maybe contribute to digestion but aren't actually part of this primary GI tract. So things like the teeth, tongue, gallbladder, some other digestive glands like your salivary glands. The liver also plays a role in the pancreas in secreting those digestive juices. So processing the food of the digestive system involves 6 essential activities of digestion. So number 1 is just ingestion or eating. So we have to introduce food into the body through the mouth or ingestion. Second process would be propulsion. So after the food has entered the mouth or the body, it has to be propelled throughout the GI tract or the alimentary canal. So some parts of propulsion include swallowing, right? So swallowing is going to propel the food down toward the stomach, and peristalsis. So peristalsis are just kind of rhythmic, alternating waves of contraction of the GI tract that's going to help propel the food along the digestive tract. Third digestive process is mechanical breakdown. So this is just physically breaking the food down into smaller pieces so that we can increase the surface area for our digestive enzymes and things to take effect. So chewing or mastication is one. Churning in the stomach is another type of mechanical breakdown. And then we have what's called segmentation. So when the food reaches the intestine, it's going to kind of shake it back and forth and mix it up with all the digestive juices as it's propelled throughout the GI tract. The fourth digestive process is digestion. So this is kind of the chemical digestion part. So it's going to use a lot of enzymes to break down, chemically break down these foods and nutrients into their most basic building blocks. So like proteins will be broken down into amino acids, fats will be broken down into simple fatty acids, and carbohydrates and starches will be broken down into simple sugars. Step 5 is absorption. So after we've chemically digested and broken down the nutrients to their most basic chemical building blocks, they're now small enough to pass through the wall of the intestine and the GI tract into the blood or the lymphatic system. And then finally, the 6th process is defecation. So it's just the elimination of any indigestible substances and waste through the anus in the form of feces. So the digestive system has its own serous membrane, so a protective covering membrane on the digestive organs called the peritoneum. Right, so it's the serous membrane of the abdominal cavity that's going to consist of the visceral peritoneum. So remember, visceral is going to line the actual surface of the organs. Parietal is going to line the body cavity wall. So then in between these two membranes, these two peritoneal membranes, we have the peritoneal cavity, which is a fluid-filled space. This is going to help to lubricate the organs and reduce any friction. Okay. So here, say this is the part of the GI tract, the alimentary canal, say maybe the intestine or the esophagus. So the visceral peritoneum is going to line the surface of that organ here in the liver, so it's lining the surface of the liver. The parietal peritoneum membrane is going to line just this cavity wall here. Okay. So the abdominal cavity also has what's called a mesentery, which is essentially just a double layer of this peritoneum. So the peritoneal membrane will kind of double back on itself, so they're fused back to back. Extends from the body wall to all the digestive organs, and it's going to provide a route for your blood vessels, lymphatic vessels, as well as the nerves. And it's just going to help to hold those organs in place as well as store some fat. So when someone accumulates a lot of belly fat or visceral fat, a lot of it will form in these mesenteries in these organs. Right, so looking at some histology of the alimentary canal. So all digestive organs are going to have the same four basic layers or tunics. So we'll have a mucosa layer, the innermost layer, a submucosa just outside of that, followed by the muscularis externa, and then finally the serosa. So the serosa is pretty much the same thing as, or it's part of that mesentery or that visceral peritoneum. So looking at the mucosa first, so this is the layer that's going to line the lumen or the opening of the GI tract. So it has a few different layers that have a couple different functions. So one function would be secrete mucus. So we want to keep the inside of the GI tract lubricated and moistened to help propel things along. It's also going to be the sites of absorption. So it's a very thin layer of tissue where those nutrients and things will be able to pass into the blood vessels. And it's also going to help protect against diseases. So there's some immune components found within these layers. So the three sublayers of the mucosa are the epithelium here. So this is the innermost layer, right, that's exposed to the lumen or the opening. The lamina propria, right, is the mid layer, this mid portion here, so where it's kind of white. And then the muscularis mucosae, so here. So the mucosa has a thin layer of muscle on its own. So again, the epithelium is generally a simple columnar epithelium. So we want a simple epithelial tissue, a thin tissue, so those nutrients can easily pass across into the bloodstream. And the mucus secreting cells are going to be throughout most of the tract as well. So some of this mucus is also going to serve a protective function. So it's going to protect the digestive organs and those tissues from some of the digestive enzymes or things like the stomach acids. It's also going to help to just ease food passage. So it's going to help keep everything moist and lubricated. The lamina propria was our second layer, so it's made up of more of a loose connective tissue, so shown kind of here in the white. So this is also where the a lot of blood vessels will be found, capillaries needed for that nutrient absorption. And as you can see here, some of the green is going to be some of our malt tissue, some lymphoid follicles to help protect against infections. And then looking at the muscularis mucosae, it's just a thin layer of some smooth muscle that's going to help with some localized movements within this mucosa layer. Okay, so looking at the submucosa, it's composed of an areolar connective tissue. So a loose connective tissue is going to contain the blood vessels, the lymphatic vessels, and the nerve plexus that's going to surround these GI tract tissues. It's also abundant in elastic fibers, elastic tissues, so that way that the GI tract, the digestive organs, can kind of restore their original shape after they've um, been storing a meal. So when you eat, your stomach stretches out, right, your intestines get full as the food passes through, but then once the food's passed through and been digested, they'll kind of snap back to their original shape. Just to go back one so you can see better. So here showing in the submucosa, so this loose connective tissue, all this shown in white, we have all of our blood vessels, our nerves, and our lymphatic vessels running through this layer. The muscularis externa is the outer muscular layer that's going to be responsible for that segmentation movement and peristalsis contractions. So it contains two layers of muscle. So we have an inner circular layer and an outer longitudinal layer. So the circular layer is going to form our sphincters in some areas and also allow for constriction or dilation of the GI tube. The longitudinal muscle is going to provide contraction, right, going in this direction, so that way we can propel and push things down along the GI tract. And finally, the serosa, our outermost layer, like I said, is also the same thing as the visceral peritoneum. So it's lining the actual organ surface, so the actual GI tract surface. And you can see how it forms the mesentery when it doubles back around itself. So we have a double layer of this visceral peritoneum or the serosa. So in the GI tract, this is formed primarily from some areolar or loose connective tissue covered with just a single layer of some simple squamous epithelium. So the blood supply to the digestive system is going to be a little bit different than maybe the regular circulatory system. So this is called the Splanchnic circulation. So as the blood leaves the heart, right, and goes through the aorta, it's going to branch off from the aorta to serve the major digestive organs. So we'll have an artery branch that goes to the stomach, one to the spleen, the pancreas. So you don't need to know specifically what these are. Just know that they branch from the aorta and serve the major digestive system organs. And then from there, all of the blood that's been taken up from the digestive organs is then going to enter the hepatic portal circulation. So instead of just returning back to venous circulation and going back into the vena cava, all of this blood now is going to be processed through the liver. So we're just going to drain the nutrient-rich blood from the digestive organs. So now that they've absorbed nutrients from the food, we're just going to process that blood and make sure it's clean. There's nothing, no bacteria or toxins or anything in it before we return it to the major circulation. Alright, so now we'll look at some functional anatomy of the digestive system, kind of starting at the beginning of the GI tract all the way to the end. Right? So starting with the mouth. So the mouth is where food is going to be ingested and introduced to the GI tract. So the mouth is going to chew the food to mechanically break it down into smaller pieces, and in the process mix it with the saliva that contains some digestive enzymes. So we start the process of digestion really in the mouth with our saliva. And then swallowing is going to propel the food to the next part of the GI tract. But some accessory or associated organs in the mouth include the tongue, the teeth, and the salivary glands. So looking at the mouth, sometimes also called the oral or the buccal cavity. So it'll be surrounded by the lips anteriorly and the cheeks on the lateral sides. Surrounded by the palate superiorly and then the tongue inferiorly. So the opening of the mouth is referred to as the oral orifice. And then the walls inside the mouth and the cheeks are going to be lined with a stratified squamous epithelium. So we want that stratified tissue to help protect against abrasion. So every time we eat or even your teeth rubbing against the inside of your mouth can kind of slough off some of those skin cells. So the cells of the gums, the hard palate, and some parts of the tongue are keratinized for some extra protection, just because they're going to be encountering more friction and abrasion when we eat and chew. So the lips and the cheeks are also parts of the mouth. So the lips, sometimes referred to as the labia, are composed of the orbicularis oris muscle, so it's kind of a circular muscle. The cheeks, composed of the buccinator muscles, so the buccal region is the cheek region. The oral vestibule is the small recess that's between the lips and the cheeks, or external to the teeth and the gums. Oral cavity proper is everything that's behind the teeth and the gums in the actual mouth. And then the lips will attach to the gums via a labial frenulum. So it's just a little piece of skin that's going to attach the lips to the gums. So looking at the palate, which is going to form the roof of the mouth. So there's two parts to the palate. The first being the hard palate. So this is formed by the palatine bones and the palatine processes of the maxilla. So it's going to form this kind of bony ridge or slightly corrugated. So we can increase the friction. So when we're chewing food and our tongue is trying to form the food into a ball or a bolus, we can rub it against kind of these ridges in the roof of the mouth to help break it down further. The soft palate is behind the hard palate. It's composed primarily of skeletal muscle. So when we swallow, it contracts and will close off the opening of the nasopharynx. It's also going to contain the uvula, which is this finger-like projection, or say the technical term is the dangly thing in the back of your throat. So it's going to hang from that soft palate. So when we swallow, the uvula will kind of be pulled upward to help close off part of that nasopharynx. So with the tongue, we're looking at the floor of the mouth. Is composed primarily of skeletal muscle. So we have conscious control, voluntary control over our skeletal muscle in our tongue. So some functions of the tongue include gripping, repositioning, mixing the food during chewing. So it's going to help us kind of manipulate the food in our mouth, move it around to form that bolus. So a bolus is just the ball of chewed up food mixed with saliva. So when we swallow, it's in a nice compact little bolus or ball that's going to travel easily throughout the GI tract. The tongue is also going to be where we have initiation of swallowing, as well as speech and our taste receptors. So there's two types of muscles in the tongue. So intrinsic muscles, we can change the shape of the tongue, and the extrinsic muscles allow us to change the tongue's position, maybe left or right, up and down. And then it'll be attached to the floor of the mouth via the lingual frenulum. Like I said, the tongue is also going to serve as our taste receptors. So it's going to have what are called your taste buds. Right? So sometimes these are referred to as papillae. So the superior surface of the tongue is going to bear these papillae or taste buds under the underlying mucosa. So there's four major types of taste buds. The first ones are the filiform papilla. So these give the tongue some texture and roughness to help increase the friction when we are breaking down and chewing food. So there aren't any real taste buds in the filiform papilla. They're more for just texture and that mechanical breakdown. The fungiform papilla are scattered kind of widely over the tongue and do have taste buds. Right? Your valate papilla or circumvallate is just this V-shaped row kind of in the back of the tongue. And then finally, the foliate papillae are on the lateral or the sides of the tongue. So these are primarily more active in children and infants than in adults. So that's why as we get older, reach adulthood, maybe our tastes for certain things have changed. So maybe things that we liked as a kid, we don't really like it anymore as an adult, or things that we thought were gross and wouldn't eat as a child, now we like as adults. Here's looking at the salivary glands. The function of saliva is to clean the mouth, keep it moist, help dissolve food chemicals for taste, moisten the food, compact it into that bolus shape. And then digestion, chemical digestion is actually going to begin in the saliva. So it contains an enzyme called amylase that's going to begin the breakdown of starch. So this is why if you chew a piece of bread or a cracker for a few seconds without swallowing it right away, it'll start to taste sweet. So that's the amylase breaking down those complex starches into more simple sugars. So most saliva is going to be produced by the major salivary glands outside the oral cavity. But there are a couple of minor ones within the oral cavity, but we're going to focus primarily on the major salivary glands. So the major salivary glands include the parotid gland, so it's just anterior to the ear. So this parotid duct is going to open near the second upper molar, so in the top of the mouth. The submandibular gland is going to open at the base of the lingual frenulum, so just under the tongue. And then sublingual is also going to secrete its saliva underneath the tongue. So saliva is mostly water. It has slightly acidic pH. It contains a few other things like some electrolytes. Of course, the amylase, some of those digestive enzymes, lipase, some proteins, so mucin to give it kind of that slimy, viscous consistency, that mucousy consistency, some lysozyme, IgA, so some immune, antimicrobial proteins and things, a few metabolic wastes. Like I said, just some substances to help protect against microorganisms. So control of salivation. So you can make up to around 1,500 mils a day of saliva. So that's about 1.5 liters. So the minor glands are continuously going to keep the mouth moist. And then the major salivary glands are going to be activated by that parasympathetic nervous system. Remember, parasympathetic is the rest and digest. Right? So this can be stimulated a couple ways. So generally, when you ingest food, you're going to stimulate the chemoreceptors and the mechanoreceptors in the mouth, telling the brain, right, that there's food in the mouth. So that's going to send signals to the salivatory nuclei in the brain stem. That's going to stimulate those parasympathetic impulses and trigger salivation from those salivary glands. So sometimes even just the sight, smell, or thought of food can act as a stimulus, so your mouth will start watering, right, when you smell food or you see someone that has some good-looking food. Also, upset GI can act as a stimulus. So sometimes if you're feeling nauseous or queasy right before you get ready to throw up, your mouth starts to water a lot. So that's to kind of help protect against the acid that's going to come from the stomach after vomiting. So the teeth are going to be found in sockets in the gums. So mastication, we said, was the process of chewing. So using the teeth, we're going to tear and grind our food into smaller and smaller fragments. So the primary dentition consists of just 20 deciduous teeth, or sometimes called the milk or baby teeth. So deciduous just means, think non-permanent. Like a deciduous forest is going to shed its leaves every year. It's trees that shed their leaves every year. So these are teeth that we shed in childhood. So then later they'll be replaced by the 32 permanent teeth. So this generally occurs around 6 to 12 years of age, right, when the baby teeth start to fall out and then are replaced by the adult permanent teeth. So usually all teeth are in by the end of adolescence, with the exception of maybe the wisdom teeth or the third molars. Those can come in pretty much any time from adolescence up until mid-late 20s. So teeth are classified according to their shape, right, which is also going to reflect their function. So the incisors, so the front teeth, these are more kind of chisel shaped for cutting. Right? The canines are sharp or fang-like teeth that are used for tearing and piercing things like meats. The premolars and the molars are more broad, so they'll have kind of rounded cusps. So these are used for grinding and crushing. So looking at tooth structure, each tooth has two major regions. So we have the crown, which is just the exposed portion that we can see above the gum, right, or gingiva. So the crown will be covered by a layer of enamel. So enamel is the hardest substance our body can make. It's similar to bone, but it's more heavily mineralized, has a lot more calcium salts and crystals in it. So once the tooth is formed and erupts from the gum line, the cells that produce this enamel are going to degenerate. So this is why our teeth can't heal if they get a cavity or a crack. We'll have to rely on artificial repairs. And then the root is just the embedded portion that's in the jawbone. So generally canines and incisors, being that they're smaller, more narrow teeth, they'll only have one root. And then when we get to the molars, some of the larger or broader teeth, they can have 2 to 3 roots. So one component of tooth structure is the cement. So this is just some calcified connective tissue that's going to act just like cement would. So it's going to help firmly attach and embed this root of the tooth into the periodontal ligament. Okay. The periodontal ligament here is formed by fibrous connective tissue, and since it's technically like a bone on bone, it is a joint. So remember from Anatomy 1, it's a special type of joint called a gomphosis. But it's just going to help anchor the tooth in the socket. And then the gingival sulcus, so a sulcus is just kind of a groove. So it's the groove where the gum borders the tooth. So this will be where things like food and plaque and bacteria can accumulate. And the dentin is some bone-like material that's underneath the enamel. So then finally, the pulp cavity is going to be surrounded by that dentin, so it's kind of protected. All the nerves and blood vessels are being protected by this hard, bony-like dentin substance. And then within the pulp cavity, you have the pulp. So the pulp consists of just your blood vessels, nerves, and connective tissues. The root canal is where the pulp cavity is going to extend all the way to the root of the tooth and exits through the apical foramen. Again, foramen just means hole, so it's just the opening at the end of the tooth where these blood vessels and nerves and things are going to enter.